The core argument is that genuine free trade, genuine capitalism allows for a democratization of power. When people can trade freely, when capital can move, when individuals can create wealth independently, power becomes decentralized.
Though the source acknowledges a potential problem with Cap 2.
It does. It acknowledges that a crony version of Cap can tragically end up looking a lot like what communism becomes: centralized power benefiting a select few. But it maintains that the reason many nations have been successfully lifted out of poverty worldwide is through genuine free trade, which fundamentally resists that single-point control mechanism of communism.
So the source argues that the anti-Israel sentiment being adopted by some Black activists today is fundamentally Marxist in origin, designed for
and that the modern Palestinian movement aligns with this framework of control.
Yeah.
Which brings us directly to the central concept of co-option.
Co-option. How does that work, according?
The sources argue that the Palestinian movement, by adopting this Marxist framework, has been incredibly successful in co-opting other movements globally. The strategy is to gather disparate groups.
Groups that might have fundamentally different goals.
Exactly. Gather them together under the umbrella of oppressed groups who supposedly share the exact same struggle against a common imperialist enemy, usually defined as the U.S., the West, or Israel.
And what are these disparate groups, according to the source? Why does this specific alignment create a disconnect for the Black liberation?
Well, the collection is wide and, according to the source, ideologically contradictory. On one side, you have the historical struggle for Black rights based on fighting for justice based on character, equality before the law.
And on the other side?
On the other side, the source claims the movement co-ops groups defined by identity politics. It includes what the source controversially terms the mentally ill, and specifically references those men who believe they're women, women who believe they're men, meaning groups focused on, let's say, radical gender identity issues.
So the source is arguing these groups are supposed to have alignment just because they're both struggling for rights, even if the original Black liberation struggle was based on entirely different principles than some modern identities.
The source argues the disconnect is profound. Black historical figures fought for a specific type of justice. The idea that you should never be judged on the basis of your birth, but instead who you are on the basis of your character.
But the source claims that by latching on to all these divergent movements
which may have highly specific or niche focus areas, Black individuals have lost sight of the core issues of oppressed versus oppressor. They've allowed themselves to be ideologically diverted.
How does the source explain that? Well, the source poses this question rhetorically. Isn't the current conflict structurally the perfect situation for Black folks in America to latch on, especially those who love to be an activist about every damn thing? It paints the ideal scenario.
A minority group, Israel, racially diverse, open to all religions, being targeted by a closed society that's tribalistic and looks to destroy the smaller group. By standard activist logic, this should draw massive solidarity towards the minority being targeted.
But the allegiance often goes the other way, which brings us to the socioeconomic explanation the source offers.
Exactly. Why is that perfect victim scenario ignored in favor of aligning with Israel's adversary? The answer, according to the source, lies in economics and envy. So the sources provide a pretty clear socioeconomic answer rooted in historical precedent. The twist, according to the source, is the culture of the
meaning cultural values, emphasizing education, family units, economic foresight.
Yes, and that this culture has resulted in greater global success. This success, especially when it's achieved in proximity to other groups, creates greater envy and suspicion. It's a difficult thing to talk about, but that's the argument.
This moves the discussion from ideology to sociology, specifically Thomas Sowell's concept of the middle. We should probably elaborate on this for our listeners.
Absolutely. Sowell's middleman group theory, it's quite powerful. It describes specific groups that, often due to forced migration or displacement, relocate globally. They typically bring specific cultural traits.
Like valuing education, high savings rates, strong community credit networks, maybe delayed gratification.
Exactly those kinds of traits. And these allow them to achieve marked economic success across very diverse regions.
What are the classic examples besides Jewish? Well, the source mentions several key historical examples to show the theory's universality. The Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Lebanese in West Africa and South America, even historical examples like Germans moving into Czechia or Slovakia.
Right. They often dominate specific commercial sectors: retail, lending, trade, occupying that economic space between producers and the broader consumer population, hence middleman.
And what's the critical consequence of this economic success for these middleman groups, regardless of their ethnicity or...
The consequence, tragically and predictably, is that they come to be viewed as highly suspicious. Their success creates intense resentment in the native or surrounding population, mainly because their prosperity is visible.
And this resentment often leads to conspiracy theory.
Pervasive conspiracy theories, claims of secret control, undue influence, exploitation. The source argues this reaction is a predictable, almost textbook manifestation of envy directed at successful, visible minority groups.
Okay, that explains the economic resentment angle, but the source then argues there's something deeper at play when it comes, suggesting the hatred transcends standard middlemen.
Yes, and we absolutely must note here, this next point represents one of the most provocative and frankly unverifiable claim in the sources you provided. It moves beyond sociology into philosophy, maybe even prophecy.
Okay, what's the claim?
The source posits there's a specific, very special sort of hatred designated for the Jew that goes beyond mere economic jealousy. It suggests this might be related to prophecy, that these things are actually written in the book of time.
So, using Sell's theory for the economic resentment, but adding this philosophical layer suggesting a unique historical or metaphysical dimension to the antagonism towards Jews.
Exactly. But sticking to the face value sociological level for a moment, the success of the Jewish community is seen as the reason, paradoxically, they aren't embraced as the perfect victim by this activist community.
Because they're too successful, too integrated, too resilient. They don't fit the required narrative of perpetual helpless oppression needed for that co-option strategy.
That's precisely the argument the source puts forward. Despite the clear ideal victim scenario, small, diverse nation targeted for elimination, the allegiance often flip.
And the sources mention a specific, quite telling condition under which some black activists do reportedly become inter-conflict.
Ah, yes, that's a telling detail. It really speaks volumes about the current activist focus, according to the source. It notes the only time they see some black folks waking up and getting interested is when information surfaces about specific black demographics within the conflict zone.
So the tragedy only becomes relevant when it can be framed through an explicit lens of black suffering.
That seems to be the implication. The specific detail cited is when they hear about the 11,000 black people living in a region in Gaza that apparently translates in English to the slave quarters.
The slave quarters, using that evocative, racially charged historical term.
That's when the source claims the lights turn on for these activists. It suggests the current focus is so specialized on racial identity and historical trauma that a human tragedy is only seen as relevant and actionable if it contains that recognizable, historically oppressed black component.
Otherwise, the economic success of the primary victim group, Israel in this case, disqualifies them from solidarity in this specific activist framework.
That's the hard-hitting conclusion drawn in the source material.
Okay, let's shift into the modern political environment. The sources analyze the political orientation of Jewish Americans and how that's reportedly changing. Historically, the source notes, many Jewish people have been liberal, a very liberal society.
That historical alignment, yes, cemented by decades of shared civil rights work, progressive politics, it's now reportedly changing, and changing rapidly.
The source observes a greater shift into conservatism politically.
That's what it claimed. And the reasoning presented is this dawning realization, supposedly, that the Liberal Party never truly saw them as foundational allies.
The perception being that the Liberal Party merely uses them for a vote. The source mentions the transactional politics experienced by leaders like Lord Zorin of New York City.
Right, but fundamentally doesn't view the Jewish community as true shared vision partner. That's the feeling described.
And the source provides a pretty controversial explanation for why the Liberal Party would strategically distance itself from its historically allied Jewish base, leading to this realignment. It used the concept of white adjacent status.
Yes, the argument presented is that within the current progressive framework, the one focused on intersectionality and perceived power structures, the Liberal Party views Jewish people as white adjacent.
Which effectively removes them from the category of marginalized or oppressed.
Exactly. And crucially, it aligns them conceptually against the struggles of groups like Palestine in the global narrative.
Even though, as the source points out repeatedly, some ideologies endorsed by this alignment, like the one attributed to Palestine in the source, hold an ideology that would wipe out in a day what many of these libs represent.
It highlights that as a profound logical and strategic contradiction within that political space.
This brings us to the core ideological parallel that the source draws maybe the most provocative connection in the entire material.
Yeah, this is probably the sharpest point made. The claimed lack of difference between the ideology of the historical aggressor, the little mustache man, and the current so-called pro-Palestinian.
The source uses blunt, uncompromising language stating there is no difference.
No difference. And the key rhetorical link they draw is to the slogan, the river to the...
which the source calls the same exact lame, played-out rhetoric, translating it solely as being about the wiping and the eradication of the Jew.
That's the stark claim, emphasizing that the modern language, even if it's wearing a different form and a different cloak, harbors an identical core goal of elimination. That is an extremely serious comparison. We absolutely must pause here and emphasize again, for you, the listener, this is the extreme interpretation and contention of the source material we are reporting, not an editorial stance. Crucial distinction. We're relaying the argument presented.
So what specific logical argument does support this profound comparison? The source argues that both ideologies, that of the historical aggressor and the ideology of eradication referenced in the current movement, they would eventually turn on their current temporary out. Meaning,
the source specifically mentions that both eliminationist ideologies would look to eliminate groups considered allies to the modern pro-Palestinian movement. It gives examples like the gay or the black or anybody else who's considering themselves as allies to this movement.
So the irony, according to the source, is that by aligning with a movement whose core tenet is seen as eradication, these activists are aligning with an ideology that would eventually target them once the initial common enemy is dealt.
That's the grim logic presented in the source.
Finally, the source directs some sharp criticism towards specific high-profile figures, people who are seen as influencing this ideological shift and leading black followers astray.
Yes, it singles out Candace Owens, or as the source refers to her, Candy Apollon,
claiming she's doing a greater disservice than she even knows. What's the critique focus?
It's focused on her shift in priority, as described by the source. She previously focused heavily on critiquing what the source describes as degenerate aspects of black culture, things like crime, fatherlessness, internal community problems.
And now the focus has shifted entirely to Jew hate, according to the source. What's the critique of that specific pivot?
The source views this pivot as strategically destructive. By shifting her fixation to anti-Semitic narratives, the argument goes she's drawing in many black followers who are looking for a new radical fixation,
thereby planting seeds of division and leading them away from what the source believes are the core, urgent, internal issues facing the black.
Precisely. It's presented as a significant new source of radicalization within black online space, validated by a prominent black voice and contributing substantially to the erosion of this historic alliance. #outro.
So to try and synthesize the central takeaways from all this source material we've unpacked, the current antagonism fracturing the Black American and Jewish alliances, well, it's presented as this highly combustible cocktail. It seems to have four major intertwined components based on the source. First, there's historical amnesia, just forgetting the shared existential danger of the 20th century.
Okay, what's second?
Second, ideological co-option, primarily driven, the source claims, by Marxist or communist frameworks focused on centralized control, which attempt to divert the focus of black liberation towards others.
Third, economic tension, described through that lens of Thomas Sowell's middleman group theory, where success, maybe inevitably, generates structural envy and suspicion.
And fourth,
political realignments, where historical allies, like Jewish Americans, are being strategically repositioned as white adjacent and therefore politically expendable by certain modern political strategies. It's a complex mix.
And the historical context we dove into the story of Eldridge Cleaver, the formation of base, it really provides necessary perspective, doesn't it? This current fracture isn't entirely unprecedented.
No, the tensions were there before.
But our sources argue that today's profound lack of historical context makes the rift far more dangerous, far more profound than ever before.
Cleaver's experience, his turnaround, it reminds us that skepticism toward externally imposed ideological frameworks, well, it has deep roots in black leadership historically.
It's a stark warning, isn't it? That ideological purity, when you adopt it without reference to lived experience or historical fact, can be a path to self-sabotage.
That seems to be a core message from the material, yes.
Indeed. Which leaves us with this final provocative thought for you, the listener. Our source material highlights that the biggest driver of the erosion in the black ship is this lack of historical context, forgetting why those two communities were allies in the first, their shared struggles, their common enemies.
So the question becomes,
what other foundational alliance beyond this specific one are maybe being eroded today because their origin stories, their shared purpose, their fundamental historical context have forgotten, or perhaps deliberately obscured?
Something to think about.
We encourage you to examine the history of any political alignment you adopt, not just the rhetoric of the moment, but the foundation.
Food for thought, indeed.
Until the next deep dive.